Okay, well, good afternoon, fellow members of the Royal Archaeological Institute and guests. You'll be surprised that I'm here today introducing the lecture. Unfortunately, our president is unwell, not COVID related, I'm pleased to be able to say, but he's asked me to step in and chair this session, which I'm very pleased to do, having excavated a few Roman roads myself. And Roman roads are important to us because they offer us an insight into how the Roman army ran its empire, holding it together with communications along roads. That is an important aspect in creating our wider understanding of the speed in which Roman communications occurred. I'm very pleased today that we have three speakers who are all part of a group that's looking afresh at Roman roads, as it were, with new eyes and new ideas. And these are, of course, very important. So I'm going to give you the names and titles of each of the lectures, and then we'll roll from one to the other. And at the end, there will be time for questions. So our first speaker will be David Ratledge, and he's going to talk to us about changing the map, the Roman roads in northwest England. And he'll be followed by Rob Entwistle, speaking about Watling Street, Stane Street, and their children. And finally, Mike Haken on pushing forwards possible new evidence for early Roman penetration into Britannia. That's the whole area of northern England, from roughly the Mersey Humber line up to roughly the Tyne Solway line, great part of northern England. So those are our three speakers, those are our subjects, and I hand you over to David for our first talk. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, David. Hopefully I'll try and share the screen. Right, hopefully you've all got that now. Yeah, so it's a good time to look at changing the map in northwest England, because the last about 8 years now, there's been a complete reappraisal of the road system there, and it's all due to something called lidar. So that we've got new routes, well, they're 2,000 years old, of course. We've filled a lot of gaps, and there's been many corrections. I'll start with the Roman Britain map from the Ordnance Survey. And you'd get the impression from this that it was a backwater, nothing going on. The Romans must have bypassed it, nothing here at all of any interest. Let's look what it really is. So this has all turned up in the last 8 years. Yeah, a massive undertaking. We can't look at all of those roads. I'll concentrate on the two north-south roads through the area, the two main trunk roads. The Ordnance Survey map only has one, but we now know there are two. And the one that the Ordnance Survey has, they have it to their own destination. But you know, let's start with the westerly one. So that's the one through Lancaster and up through the Lake District, as we now know. So I'll pick it up at Preston, looking towards Lancaster. This is a Google Earth picture. The road was lost between Preston and Lancaster. Nobody knew where it was. There was about a mile at Lancaster known, about a mile at Preston. But in between, nobody knew. But in fact, everybody you spoke to would tell you where it was. And only about half a mile of all those guesses were right. What I needed was one point to work from. If I could find it in one place, then I was away. And it turned up there just south of Garstang. Now, this is what a Roman road looks like in lidar. Here it is coming through that field, down through that field, and on. So I had a fix and I had a direction. And I could work it south to Preston. That was tricky, faint, but it could get the route definitely to Preston. We'll have a look heading north. So we're now above Garstang, which is halfway between Preston and Lancaster. And this was the only bit anybody got right, by the way, about half a mile here. And Lancaster's at the top. Everybody said it went through Golgate. The colour scheme for this lidar view is blue is sea in Roman times. So that's all reclaimed land. And you can see it's not pointing at Lancaster at all. It never went through Golgate. This was the route it went. He went to the seaside at Cockerham. Obviously, a coastal connection was a high priority. So they went to Cockerham, and only at Cockerham did they turn to Lancaster. Came as a huge surprise, but it shouldn't have been. If we'd looked at Leland's account from when he journeyed around the country, if you were travelling in the 1530s, 1540s, you were still following Roman roads. So apart from Garstang, I passed partly by moor ground, partly by pasture and some corn, riding over the Gurkha River, that's the river there. I came to Cockerham, the sands by Cockerham village. So it tells us that Cockerham was on the seaside then, it was a coastal village, and he went via Cockerham to Lancaster. So we shouldn't have been surprised. I'll just show you one of the pieces of the road just north of Cockerham. Typical road, 8 meters across, over half a meter thick. Yeah, definitely there. We've reached up to Lancaster now. Can we get any further north? Remember, this is uncharted territory. So here we are coming into Lancaster, our road coming in down Penny Street, the fort on the hill. And up at the top there is an agger. Just make out an agger that we spotted quite early. So we can join that up using existing roads and features across there to it. And 6 years ago, we excavated there. Here's Mike, a younger Mike, excavating. And there's the east ditch of the road and the road coming up there. We picked a terrible spot to excavate because that was a demolished building we didn't know about, but there's the camber of the road going over. So we were quite pleased to find that. So we've come up from Lancaster, we've got to Carnforth, Wharton, and we're trying to get up to the north towards Watercrook, Kendal. And there's all these mosses. How on earth are you going to get through that? Well, let's see what Leland said again. The ground between Wharton and about is very hilly, marvellous rocky onto Beetham. Bytham, he spelt it. In the rocks, I saw herds of goats. So we've got a clue. We went to Rocky and High Line is the one. We're looking back from Beetham. Here's Wharton Crag, and there is a high road, rocky road, over the back straight. And the only way through the mosses is Stang End Bridge, and that lines up, and we drop down to Beetham. So yes, we've found the most likely route for the road back, the only route through the moss. So let's now take up to Ambleside, trying to get to Ambleside from Watercrook at Kendal. So here's Kendal Fort, lovely square fort, just surviving the meanders of the river. Any clues? We have a cutting there, an agger there, another agger, and more aggers there. So we can plot the course quite easily on towards Staveley in the Lake District. We'll look at this piece here, definite Roman road. I've called it curbstones here, but it's probably more a revetment. It's more building up the low side of the road. But there's our road, no doubt at all. The other side of the quarries at Kendal, absolutely clear again across the bypass, no question. And it had to go to Staveley. Staveley is the only route into the lakes, the sensible route into the lakes. The modern road goes that way, the old road goes that way, the railway, the aqueduct, all that way. Beyond Staveley, the road appears, Ambleside Fort's down there below the Langdales, and here they've managed to find a nice level patch of ground. It's quite steep down to the Lake Windermere, but the Roman surveyors found a lovely patch to get their road across. So this is where we've been following it over from Staveley, across the Troutbeck Valley, beautiful zigzags down. That was the level bit we were looking at, where they found that level bit, and into the fort at the head of Windermere. And as soon as I saw that, yes, that's typical Roman. Previous suggestions were over here, and that they're absolutely ridiculous. I wouldn't have gone up there. So we now got to Ambleside. Can we get any further north? Let's have a look. So we're looking north at Ambleside. So here's our road coming in from Watercrook. There's the fort at the head of the lake. There was a known road out to Ravenglass over Hardknott, but there was no known road to the north. And yet, if you look top left, is Dunmail Raise. If you've been to the lakes, it's the only way, sensible way through the lakes is over Dunmail Raise. They weren't going to miss that. They weren't going to not use that. And sure enough, the evidence is there. There's our road, there's our agger, heading round, past Rydal, heading up Dunmail Raise. Too good to miss. We're on Dunmail Raise looking north. Here's our road, clear as clear. So it's not a severe pass at all. It's easy, an easy route through. And there's our road heading down towards Thirlmere. We'll pick it up now at Thirlmere. The modern road overlies it a bit there. The smart money at this time was that this road was going to Keswick over there to the left. But this colleague, Ben Gethin, spotted that stretch of Agger there. And that doesn't point to Keswick, that points to St John's in the Vale. Hugh Toller, another colleague of ours, unfortunately we've lost him now, found two patches, a piece there and a piece there in St John's in the Vale. It was all fitting together. Meanwhile, coming in the opposite direction, I was working past Troutbeck. Troutbeck is between Penrith and Kenrith, Penrith and Keswick, and I was working the road coming this way. And it was quite easy to work out where it was going, still surviving extremely well. So turn round and look the other way now. So we're looking west. So there's the road that I was following. And it hit a brick wall at Threlkeld. I could not get it onwards to Keswick. There was a book on a Roman route across northern Lakeland going to Keswick, but it doesn't. It didn't go any further. But if you remember, Hugh Toller was coming up through St John's in the Vale. And amazingly, the roads meet. The penny dropped. It wasn't a road across the lake, North Lakes. This was a north-south road. This was a new strategic route through the Lake District. And from Troutbeck, the known road went from Troutbeck to Old Penrith Fort, which is between Penrith and Carlisle. And there's the road coming in, bit of a zigzag at the end, and it joins into the fort. So we've got a new strategic road all up the west side going to Old Penrith Fort and hence on to Carlisle. Let's have a look at the internal one now, this one that was already known about, but with the wrong destination. We'll pick it up between Manchester and Ribchester. It was lost at Edgeworth. Because of all the hills there, it wasn't known, but it was easy enough to find that. That wasn't difficult. But what was more interesting was what appeared on that corner there, on that headland. I'll blow that up. And here we have a fortlet, typical fortlet, nice round corners, double ditches all the way around it. This is the road here, by the way, dropping down. This is Wayo Bridge. So this was an unknown fort. And there's an aqueduct coming down, bringing water, an open water course, bringing water down to the fort. Forget these are modern tracks. So there it was. And it's where you'd expect it. Manchester Ribchester is 30 miles. You would expect something halfway, staging point halfway. So on to Ribchester. The big puzzle there was, where was the bridge? Where did they get across the River Ribble? There's the Ordnance Survey route, get rid of that. White is where it really is. I could find these quite easily. That's the York Road, and this is a link road in, and this is the one from Manchester. So where the three routes meet, and where the river was, of course, would be where the bridge was. And the river's moved. The fort's gone with it. So there's all these old courses, and there's one of those would fit. So if you imagine the river was over there, then the lines all match. And I've been to that point there, that Agger stops dead, and there's plenty of stones there. No question, that's where the bridge is. So on from Ribchester, let's see if we can get further north. So that we've got to get over the hills now. We've got to get over the Bowland Fells. And they got brilliant engineering again. Here it comes over Longridge Fell. There's a big turn and heads to the hills. And by turning down this slope like that, they got this the gradient down to 1 in 11. And this is mighty steep. And yet by angling, they got it to 1 in 11. Very, very clever surveying. Over the hills, and we drop down north of the Bowland Fells into the Hyndburn Valley. Is the route right on the maps? Not quite. So here's the lidar route. That's where it really is. Let's look at that point there. Here's the Ordnance Survey current map. Let's fade in the lidar, see what we can see. There it is. There's the Agger. If you've got a good computer screen, you might see that zigzag. Beautiful zigzag down the slope, more Agger. So that's the way it went up there. We'll just look off the top of this screen now. We'll just look off the next bit. The OS had 2 goes at this route. This was the 1850 route. They obviously got worried there was nothing there, moved it over to there. So where is it really? They're nearly right in 1850, but not quite. So there it is crossing the valley, and we'll have a quick look at that. Beautiful, beautiful engineering, a cutting there, zigzag cutting down, another zigzag cutting up. This is obviously Romano British with a couple of roundhouses. The 1850 route went straight through it, but no, it went round it. On to the next fort at Barrow. Here's our road on the right, going to a mile to the east of the fort. So there had to be link roads. no sign of those until lidar solved it. To the fork, obviously one for north and one for south. But the other thing that turned up was the Vickers. That was unknown. That Vickers to the west of the fort strips the road down to the river. So quite clear a Vickers there. So we've got to Burrow. Let's see if we can get into the Loon Gorge, the Burrow Low Borrow Bridge. Now the road was known pretty well, apart from at Sedbergh where it crosses the Rothay and was washed away, or thought to be washed away. Low Borrow Bridge is up in the Loon Gorge there. Another easy route through, like relatively easy route through the hills. So where's our road? Well, actually, some of it had survived. I don't know if you can just see it, but there's the agger. There's our straight agger. So there, the missing bit could be filled in, and there's our route running through into the Loon Gorge to Low Borrow Bridge Fort. And if you've driven the M6, this is the M6 here, you're probably familiar with seeing the road on the far side. But we now know that that road was probably superseded. It was probably replaced by a road this side. And this only came to light this last year. So there's the East Bank route. We've come back to Sedbergh. The East Bank route is the one that was known. But last year I found a branch coming off here. And if it's a branch off this one, it must be later. It must have superseded it. So let's have a look at that view of Sedbergh again. And there's the road we knew. Where's the new one? It's half a mile shorter, but I don't think it was the distance. I think it's because the bridge is on this one. It crosses the river at rocky points. So whereas the Sedbergh one, all meanders and a mess, you can get solid bridge points on that. So I think that's the reason. We'll just have a look over Furbank. Very, very clear over Furbank there. Very, very clear. And that explained Fox's pulpit. This is Fox's pulpit. Here's the plaque marking it, and this is the road coming up that we now know is Roman. And this George Fox in 1652, this was probably the birthplace of Quakerism, or one of the birthplaces of Quakerism. It was thought to be in the middle of nowhere on a country lane going to nowhere, but it wasn't. It's on the main Roman road to the north. So we've got to Low Borrow Bridge, and we'll see how far we can get from there. So there's the fort. M6 has made a bit of a mess of it, aqueduct road coming in. And another colleague, Brigantia again, found the camp up there, and there's our road going through it. So it goes over the hills again and drops down to Crosby Ravenworth. This is you close, the Romano-British settlement here shows it very, very clearly. And here's our road coming in. And that's where the problem started, at that stream. There was no real good evidence for where it went after that. But in the 1920s, Percival Ross, largely on hedgerows, managed to get a route to Brougham, by the way, it's pronounced Broome, to get a route to Broome into Penrith. And that was the route that's on the maps, been in books for 100 years. But if you look carefully, it's there. This was spotted by the late Hugh Toller, the first road discovered by lidar, I think, in this country. So there it is. It's not going to Penrith, it's going to Kirby Thor. Lovely zigzags as well. But boy, is that road faint. It's not easy to spot. This is the only piece I could find that looked like a Roman road. This is where it's crossed the Livenant Valley and coming up. Quite clear there, coming up, bit of a cutting. And on to Kirby Thor. This gives you an idea how faint it is. It's there, but gosh, you'd never have spotted that without lidar. And on to Kirby Thor. Right, we've reached Kirby Thor. Can we join up with our other road? Is there actually a missing link? And there was a bit of a clue in 2005. This is the map of that area. The road comes up from York over Stainmoor, Kirby Thor, turns left for Broome and on that way. But there was a milestone found in the Langbathby parish. So somewhere around here is a road, must be a road. So I was looking there for a branch. So I'm looking for a simple branch. And it came up with this. It's a crossroads. How can you have a crossroads if you've only got 3 roads? It gets worse. There's a road there. And this road is the missing road to Old Penrith, lines up with that piece there. Let's put that on a map and see if we can make sense of it. It's a spaghetti junction. We've got a northern crossing, a southern crossing, obviously, two crossings of the River Eden. What can we say? Well, the Broome Road points to the northern crossing. The Old Penrith Road, the one we've just discovered, also points to the northern crossing. So that clearly is stage 1. And if you notice the name Winderwath, Wath means ford, and the river moves around here, so it's a good fording place. You get fed up of paddling after a while, don't you? They obviously wanted a bridge. And the best place for a bridge is down here where sandstone outcrops. There's a sandstone rocks here, so you would want to build the bridge down here. And so you've got to link that in. So you build another road to the bridge and then connect to your original roads. And those roads are no longer needed. So the crossroads never was a crossroads. It never actually behaved as a crossroads. So we've reached Old Penrith and on to Carlisle. Have a quick look now, just finish off looking at the one of the puzzles of the Stane Gate. So this is the road over from Carlisle to Corbridge. And there was one huge gap in it between, we're east of Brampton here. So that the road comes in from Corbridge and then it was known at Quarrybeck heading on there. Pottsclough is famous for a massive cutting. It's about 30 feet deep they dug down to build the road, massive cutting, 30 feet deep. And yet between Pottsclough and another cutting at Quarrybeck, the road was lost. So where is it? Doesn't go to Quarrybeck at all. Comes down the hill and heads off direct to Brampton and perhaps Warwick Bridge and into Carlisle that route. But there must have been a link. Yes, there is a link. So what's the likely explanation? I'm not the first to suggest this. It's a suggestion that was two Stane Gates, an early direct one and a later one which served the fortlets and forts that were then added to it. And last one, have a look at the new one. It's hot off the press, the Western Stane Gate from Carlisle to the west. So here it is, Carlisle over to the right there, and here's a direct route to Kirkbride. It was Professor Barry Jones who suggested there would be a road there. He suggested it went across here to Burwan. Burwan is contemporary with Kirkbride, so he suggested it went over this route and presumably that way, but no, it's direct. And Burr would have been just connected in. There is a road there that probably suggests it. Another very early road I found was in from Old Carlisle to Kirkbride. So that was probably the Western Stane Gate. What happened when Hadrian's Wall arrived? Well, we get Burby Sands. That's easy to connect that fort in. Richard Bellhouse got part of that road and I was able to complete it to Drumber Fort and Bowness. And recently I've just been able to find pieces of this road onto Bowness. Kirkbride was no longer a fort. It became a road junction rather than the fort, decommissioned. So it was a road junction. So that appears to be how the western half of the Hadrian's Wall was served. So that's where we are. We started with a backwater, nothing going on. We then learned that it's a fantastic road network, probably better than the one we've got. And these are all the new ones. It would take me hours to go through them all, even one off the map. And a new route to Scotland. Netherby isn't a cul-de-sac. There are two roads beyond Netherby into Scotland. So I better finish there. But yes, it wasn't a backwater. There was a lot going on here.
And it's now down to me, I think, Rob Entwistle, to take over for my part of the lecture from the Triple RA today. Now, my focus is on looking at roads, particularly in the southeast, and their planning. So I'm going to try sharing my own screen. And hopefully you can see that. And let's start the slides. And there we go. So my focus is looking at roads and their planning, particularly in the southeast, an area where many of the roads are considered pretty well understood. I will be investigating evidence for a level of early planning that hasn't been noticed so much, and that will lead us to question what the Roman intentions actually were from the earliest times. So let's start, as David did, with looking at the Ordnance Survey map of the area, looking at the southeast. We might feel that what can be said about those roads has been said about them. It's a familiar image of roads radiating out of London then as now. And it tends to be assumed that this scenario is a product of the time when London started taking over from Colchester as the capital of the new province, whatever that might mean. Today, we're looking at the planning of these roads and questioning some assumptions. Apart from what looks like a fairly random radiation of roads from London, there's not too much that jumps out as odd or striking, but I do want to draw your attention to two things. First, the odd and straight alignment here of Stane Street towards Chichester as it leaves London, first mentioned by Captain Grant, as far as I'm aware, in the 1920s. And secondly, these roads here, twin roads seemingly, crossing the Weald, southeast of London. And those two roads should be considered really both odd and striking. Two parallel roads, and they are pretty much parallel, some 8 miles apart, laid out by surveyors who had no magnetic compass, no Ordnance Survey maps, no theodolites or other lensed optical surveying instruments. We might not ask only how they did it, but why Roman surveyors thought it worthwhile doing that. We can assume perhaps that Roman surveyors wouldn't make things hard for themselves just for the sake of it, if they didn't have to. The least we can say, looking at this, is that there seems to be a level of organised planning that perhaps isn't otherwise evident from a glance at the map. Inevitably, I'm going to need to keep moving at a fair clip in this presentation. And if it does leave some of you seething with questions and comments, it's a matter of need must when the devil drives. Of course, I am happy to take questions afterwards if there's time, or indeed for you to contact me separately. But for the next slide, we're actually moving away from the southeast, right up to the northeast and Deer Street. John Poulter, in his 2009 Bar publication, Surveying Roman Military Landscapes across northern Britain, was the first to publish information demonstrating that certain Roman roads had previously undiscovered levels of planning behind them. He showed that behind all the details of the route, there were a number of very long basic alignments forming a skeleton upon which the detail of the road's route was hung. So we've got here Tadcaster up to the Scotch Corner area, and then from Scotch Corner up to towards Esh, and then from Esh over to Dryburn, which is where the long alignment stopped, though Deer Street carries on. At the time when John Poulter was publishing this work, I was separately finding an underlying framework of alignment for some other roads. Not every road, in fact, very much a minority, but some striking examples. And the suspicion grew that these alignments were a separate, earlier planning exercise, not directly linked to the construction of the road as we see them preserved today. And sometimes perhaps supporting other forms of strategic activity. In fact, it seems that this form of long-distance surveying may have been one of the first things that the Romans did on starting to exploit an area. And in my book, Brigantia Surveyed, which was published some 18 months ago, I draw attention to a number of other roads across Britain displaying these features and look at some of the other planning issues that may have been drawn in. But before we move on from Deer Street, I would like to just draw your attention to two things. First of all, the fact that Ebchester Fort is located on the alignment, but the road as constructed later didn't quite follow that, but had to come across to it and then away again and back onto the alignment up there. And secondly, that the angle by which that road turned was measured by John Poulter at 36.5 degrees. So not at the time when he actually was publishing his work. That measurement wasn't taken place till afterwards. And we're going to come back to both of those aspects as typical characteristics of the alignments. Because one of the characteristics that emerges from long distance planning lines in general seems to be their use of a small number of pre-established set angles, habitually used when it came to turns or branches. And that certainly would help surveyors keep a firm record of how and indeed where the lines have been laid out and to record them. And in fact, I found 4 such set angles which seem to have been in regular use, which I've termed for convenience alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And as you see, they're not particularly tidy angles. These 4 set angles do seem to relate to the way the Romans thought of angles, which was not as something measured in degrees. Degrees have been around a long time, since Babylonian times. By and large, for terrestrial surveying, the Romans didn't use them. They understood angles as something subtended, seems to be, by right-angled triangles. And here we see alpha and beta, which are the 2 angles of the very well-known 3-4-5 Pythagorean triangle, which Vitruvius talked about and linked to Pythagoras. And also another Pythagorean triple, the 8-15-17 triangle. Both triangles, as Pythagorean triples, having their sides measured in whole units. Whole units, whether it's 3, 4, 5, whether it's 8, 15, and 17. There's a family of those triangles. The reason for explaining all that will become clearer in a few minutes. But first, we need to step back to the alignments of the southeast. Now, I did say that John Poulter was the first to draw attention in a publication to long distance alignments, but Michael Lewis in 2001 had come very close to that concept by drawing attention to the long alignment underpinning Watling Street from Canterbury through to Westminster. In his remarkable book, Surveying Instruments of Greece and Rome. And he showed that a single alignment between Westminster and Dunkirk, that is Dunkirk in the UK, of course, not Dunkirk in France, was used as a guide for construction, which was respected but not slavishly followed by this section of Watling Street. And that, as we've seen already, seems typical of these planning lines. They're followed by roads when it's convenient, and they're not where they're not. And Michael Lewis reckoned that it was surveyed from the Westminster end through to Dunkirk with a subsidiary alignment there. Now we see here that that there is a north arrow there, which shows us that we do not have north at the top of this map. Clearly, we could get a better view of the way it's laid out on the ground if we looked at a typical Ordnance Survey type map with north at the top. If we want to relate this alignment to others, though, it helps to have a really precise bearing for any given alignment. And the best way to do that is to take 2 clear points on the alignment and find clear national grid reference points, say here and here, and then mathematically work out what the bearing is between them. And if we do that, then it works out that the angle of this alignment is 105.01 degrees, measured from the west to the east. That becomes relevant if we try and relate it to other alignments. So let's do that now. This is the London area, and this is where the Watling Street alignment we've just been looking at is coming in here to Chatham Hill, and then moving on and eventually down to Westminster. But we can see here that it may not stand alone, because if we extend that alignment on across the river, we see there what seems to be a really quite neat symmetrical relationship between these two roads. This one, which is a continuation of Watling Street North, whether or not the Romans thought of it as the same road, and this road, which is the Silchester Road down to Staines and the crossing of the Thames. And when we're looking at this, we are looking at the key alignments that we see on the roads, because both of those key alignments we can track back to this area, which is basically Hyde Park. And although Watling Street came down through Marble Arch, the Silchester Road did not, but the alignments are something else. And there is every sign that the Colchester Road, what Margaret calls the Great Road to Colchester, behaves in a very similar way, and also seems to have come in here to the edge of Hyde Park. But I have done that one in green, because there is still work to be done on clarifying the alignment of this road and west of Stratford. All of these roads have identifiable alignments between 7 and 10 miles long as they are running out of London. You may notice that the angles here look really quite similar to the angle that we noticed on Deer Street over here. If we actually have a measure the bearings of these roads, these in exactly the same way as we did with Watling Street and that alignment there, then we can work out what the angle is between them. And what we find is that this angle here is 37.02 degrees, which compares with the perfect beta angle of 36.87, well within half a degree. And if we look at the Silchester Road, 36.79 degrees, again, well within half a degree of the beta angle. So, which is, of course, the same angle that we found on Deer Street. So it seems that we do have some evidence that there was long distance planning here, which seems to be based on this sort of area, perhaps the crossing of the Thames, and here the higher ground above the Thames used for laying out. There is one more alignment that I've marked on this map, and it's here, the initial alignment of the so-called London Lewis Road. So what about this? Well, it's clearly not the same. The angle there, if we measure it, it comes out at 61.79 degrees. But again, this is one of our set angles, this time gamma down here, and it's again comfortably within half a degree. And you'll remember perhaps that this is the road that we noticed on our first slide, which is that dual twin road crossing the two roads, crossing the Weald. Finding that has a set angle too suggests a certain amount of family planning going on in this area. Let's see what happens if we do follow this alignment further south. This is the alignment coming here from the London area, from Watling Street to the edge of the North Downs. The road itself then slopes down the escarpment of the North Downs, possibly following the line of an early trackway, and then does the rather peculiar thing of taking up the same alignment parallel to it, about a kilometre away. But if we take this through as the key alignment to Camp Hill, here at Camp Hill we are at the southern edge of the Weald, overlooking the Green Sand Way coming through here, and the turn is 28.15 degrees, which is delta. It's within a quarter of a degree of the perfect delta angle. If we look at this road, which is the road down to Hassocks, which goes back eventually to Stane Street, but with clearly parallel, if we follow that alignment back beyond the point where the road leaves it, we find it actually reaches this same alignment at the top of the North Downs escarpment and seems to have been clearly surveyed from there. So again, a delta angle. So it's really no surprise that the two roads end up as parallel. Whether the Romans desperately wanted that or not is a different matter, but it's come about as a result of their planning systems. All part of the family. So that only leaves two major roads out of London, which we've left out of the family, and that's Stane Street down to Chichester and Ermine Street heading north. So let's go on to have a look at those. Well, Stane Street. Who hasn't talked about Stane Street? A lot of ink has been spilled, certainly since the time of Captain Grant, I already mentioned in the 1920s. Before him, Hilaire Belloc, who wrote a study of it before the First World War. Its fabled accuracy out of London on an alignment that if you follow it straight through, though the road never did, all the way down to Chichester East Gate, apparently 60 miles away, the end of the stuff of endless speculation. But of course, what we have to remember is that neither London Bridge nor Chichester were there when the Romans arrived. There was no Iron Age settlement at either of those precise spots. Although incredibly hard to target a precise spot from London without map or compass, it's much less hard to send out a survey planning line in the general direction of the broad area, the focus of the pre-Roman southern kingdom lying here defended behind the Chichester dykes. We remember Ebchester Fort, how that seems to have been placed because of the planning line and then Deer Street finding its way to it. We may be facing the same thing again, in which we have an early planning line lead out from the London area and the military base, which eventually grew into Chichester. Early Roman buildings have been found underneath the later town. And then having such a line was very useful when it came to guide the road and plan the road. And if again we follow that line beyond the Thames in the same way as we did with Watling Street line, we find that it links at a good delta angle to Ermine Street heading northward, which brings the last of the Roman roads out of London into the family. So we are facing something that looks like an interconnected network of long distance alignments, all of which can be reconstructed by tracking back those initial long alignments of every main road out of London, with two main areas of focus: Hyde Park, not that I'm suggesting Hyde Park was a thing in Roman times, and the Thames crossing at what became the Thames Bridge, London Bridge. And most fundamental of all, of course, to all of those, the long alignment, Westminster Canterbury alignment, which others plug into via the four planning angles. that we've already met and which we find so often on long distance alignments. We can speculate why this was done, but it would certainly allow the whole system to be recorded for army archives or back at Rome and understood. So we have this scenario of the London area, apparently from very early times, being set up as some form of planning hub with directional pointers towards, well, really everywhere that mattered in late Iron Age Britain. The power centres north of the Thames, Camalodunum, Verulamium. These lines didn't point directly there, but they were the lines that were used by the roads when the roads came to be built to those places. Calais, Silchester, down here, towards what rapidly became the restored Southern Kingdom under Cogidubnus or Togidubnus. And here, of course, leading in the general direction of Lincoln, the Humber, which was an early area of interest for the Romans in beginning to expand the domination in areas perhaps that were not quite part of the province in the early stages. All that, quite possibly, before London was properly established. Down here, not a political centre as in the other areas, but still areas that were of strategic interest. The Weald, ironworks, and also perhaps boundary between Kent and elsewhere, the tribes. Which leaves us with a question. Was London, as it became, the unplanned and spontaneous creation of enterprising merchants, as has often been suggested? Or did Roman officialdom have some sort of plans for the area right from the start? And in creating their planning hub, we're left with the question, what was their ambition for this greenfield site from the earliest years? Whatever that ambition may have been, it is the roads that have preserved it for us. And that's where I stop, and I will stop my screen share to hand over to Mike.
Right, my time to take over. Hopefully that's working. I can see myself on screen, so it should be. I'll try sharing screen. And hopefully in a second. Okay. Let's drag that over. Right. I can only hope that my own lecture is as informative and thought-provoking as Rob and David's excellent pieces. In the past 2 decades, more new and reassessed evidence has suggested that many early Roman military sites in the north may be actually earlier than the early AD 70s dates usually assumed. Indeed, the RAI's secretary, Pete Wilson, has published 2 papers summarising this evidence. This lecture presents further evidence for early activity, specifically for a possible Roman fortified route into Brigantian territory before, hang on, I've just got a slight tech problem, there we go, before it was annexed by Rome in the early AD 70s. The research presented has all been conducted for the association by a dedicated band of volunteers with lidar analysis, drone photography, and substantial geophysical survey using our own equipment with geophysics training and supervision provided by James Lyle. Okay, The map shows the possible military dispositions in about AD 55 on the northern edge of Roman control. There was no formal frontier, but the extent of control approximated to the valley of the River Trent. Behind the river, I'm going to turn on my laser pointer, we lost my place. The frontier was represented largely by the western end of Watling Street and the northeastern end of the Fosse Way. You'll note there's a line of sites along the Fosse Way marked in grey. The reason for that, they were all later settlements for which have been claimed Roman military origins. Actually, the only one that's got any firm evidence for it is East Stoke, or Ad Pontum, to give it its Roman name. Ahead of the Trent, we have a line of 4 so-called vexillation fortresses, each big enough for a vexillio, that's half a legion, there, and there. The poorly understood site at Derby, Strutt's Park, could potentially be a 5th, if that indeed itself is a fortress, and that would leave a gap between Derby and Kinvaston, which, as you can see, there could well be a 6th that we currently don't know about. The legionary fortresses at Roxton and Lincoln at the ends of the line might actually be slightly later, although it's probable that the 14th and 9th legions were active in the area at the time. I don't want to go into the details of the evidence for each site because it is quite thin and sometimes a little controversial. Okay, to the north, we had the vast territory of the Confederation of the Brigantes, whose main centre was at Stanick. I've lost my pointer. There we go, which is, I've still lost my pointer. That's it, back again, which is up there, north of Richmond in North Yorkshire, alongside the Parisi in what is now the East Riding. Both were probably client kingdoms allowed to maintain their independence in return for the provision of military security along the border. In AD 51, after leading a guerrilla war against Rome for years, Caratacus was finally defeated and sought refuge with Cartimandua, Queen of the Brigantes, who promptly handed him back over to Rome. Cartimandua's actions caused discontent amongst the Brigantian elite, which eventually boiled over into insurrection. In the words of the 1st century historian Tacitus, the enemy invaded her kingdom, which probably means that a sept of the Brigantes revolted. He also records that a legion under Caesius Nesica then fought a successful action in Brigantian territory. Now, it's very striking that at some point in the mid-50s, there was also a sudden expansion northwards from the Trent into Brigantian territory. It seems perfectly reasonable to suggest that this area might have been the territory of the Brigantian sept that Nesica defeated. The forts at Templeborough and Chesterfield almost certainly date to this period, as may the little understood site at Pentridge. And in addition, we have the vexillation fortress at Rossington, which we're assuming moved up from Osmonthorpe. Now, the events following the handing over of Caratacus also had an impact much closer to Cartimandua's power base up at Stanick. Just southeast of Stanick is the late Iron Age settlement there at Scotch Corner, strategically positioned where the Stainmore Pass, that's over here, meets the routes up through the Vale of York and Vale of Mowbray on towards the Mid-Tees Valley. Recent excavations at Scotch Corner have shown that substantial quantities of high-status Roman goods had been arriving there up until around about AD 55. Then suddenly everything changed. Enclosures went out of use and a new ladder settlement was formed, with new commodities arriving, which are generally of a type transported through military networks. This suggests that the deployment of Roman troops there, or at the very least, there was a presence of Roman military, which begs a question. Did the Roman military connection with Stanick and Scotch Corner come from the North Sea up the Tees Valley, as is recently proposed by Martin Millett and Rose Farraby, or did troops travel safely through potential hostile territory here up the Vales of York and Mowbray, a distance of some 71 miles? incidentally. The beginnings of the answer may well lie with the discovery of a new Roman road, which links the fortresses of Osmonthorpe and Rossington, as marked there. A short stub of this road just to the south of Rossington was already known. However, a discovery by Tim Jeffrey, one of our members, led to the realization that it did in fact run from the Osmonthorpe fortress 28 miles to the south via Billsthorpe, Ollerton and Blythe. The road had actually been suggested before by a completely different route and heading not to Rossington but to Bawtry, but we've now got it. The road shows extremely well in several places on lidar. I'll show you a sample in a minute, and its course is now regarded as certain. Moving down onto the Fost Way to the southeast from East Stoke, Had Ponton, Tim and I have also confirmed the road previously proposed by Von Boutwood that links Had Ponton to Ancaster on Ermine Street. And this is important because it then provides a direct link to Rossington from Colchester up Ermine Street, Ancaster and along that way. The new road, this one, is roughly parallel to Ricknell Street running north from Derby and also to Ermine Street running north from Lincoln. And these three roads could well be part of a three-pronged plan centred on the Rossington fortress to enable the rapid movement of parts of 2 legions north into the rest of Brigantia, the 14th coming from Wroxeter up that way, and elements of the 9th moving either from the Vexillation fortresses or from Lincoln that way, and potentially also across that route, although we don't believe that route had been built by this time. Here's a sample I promised you. This is just to the northeast of Clumber Park in Nottinghamshire. It's the interchange of the A614, A57 and A1, which is all there. And there's the Roman version of the A1, which you can see clearly running through underneath the woods. You look at the aerial photograph, however, and you can't see a thing. So you can easily understand why nobody had spotted this before until Tim did a couple of months ago. Unfortunately, I can't show you the really nice colour images that David's got. I don't have access to that software. Very jealous. Anyway, moving on. That's the line, and there we go. Next slide. Going to the top of this road, to the northern end, at the fortress at Rossington, this is one of the images that led to the fortress's identification, part of the Cambridge collection. And if you look very, very carefully, just there, you can see a double ditch feature, which is the edge of the fortress. It actually returns along a line here and runs up roughly in that direction. And if you look there, you can clearly see the Roman road. The central portion, the actual carriageway of the road, is in the middle. You have 2 shoulders either side, and then finally a ditch. Classic Roman road structure in the lowlands. Now, crucially, when this road meets the River Torn, which is just up there, it changes direction. You can see from what I've shown you, with the edge of the fortress being about on that line, it doesn't line up with the fortress at all. But once it's changed direction, the new alignment heading off the image to the north aligns perfectly with the western defences of the fortress. The implication being that the road probably came first. So going back to the map, we have a road that extends beyond the fortress, but where does it go next? The map presents the picture now in about AD 61, moving on a little bit, following the Boudiccan Rebellion of AD 60. Note the additional sites in the west, which are probably associated with Paulinus and his activities in North Wales. Our interest, however, is focused on these two, the known forts at Roll Manor and Burg Wallace. Roll sits on an old course of the River Aire and may originally have protected an overland route north from Rossington that was never actually made into a formal road, with no evidence whatsoever of a road going to Roll. The land is part of the Humberhead Levels, which is extremely low-lying and in the early Roman period would have been marshy and very prone to extreme flooding. In fact, it's still prone to extreme flooding. The fort is known to be covered with a metre-deep layer of alluvial sand, which rather illustrates the point. But unfortunately, because of it, surface finds are few, and we have no accurate dating evidence. Similarly, the signals from magnetometry aren't great either, thanks to that depth of sand between the surface and the archaeological deposit. I've really hiked the contrast up on this so you can see it. This was carried out by us last year. We just managed to sneak it in around lockdown. The aim was to try and add some clarity to the interpretation of the site. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is the total lack of a Roman road. Plenty of trackways, one there, but no Roman road leading to or from the site that we can see. Now, this site had previously been identified as Flavian because of the northern entrance. It had been assumed that that curved feature there was something called a parrot beak, what's known as a parrot beak, where the outer ditch curves inwards to meet the inner one, sometimes actually extends further inwards from that. However, I can't show you because we don't have time for another image, but you'll take my word for it, that little blob is not a curve at all. It's almost certainly a much later pit that just happens to be in a place that makes it look like a parrot beak. When you zoom on the image, it's very, very clear. Okay, the result of that is if we can rule out a Flavian date, we simply don't know the date that this fort was established here. We cannot rule out an early 60s date, neither can we actually rule out one from the mid 50s. But as was established, we know for certain that no built road ever went past Roll Manor. There's not a scrap of evidence for it, at least. But what about the alternative, Burg Wallace, a possible drier alternative sticking to higher ground? This was surveyed by us in 2019 to 20, or at least what's left of the fort was surveyed by us. Previously it had been known only by crop marks, but we can now see it very clearly despite most of the fort there, as you can see, being destroyed by quarrying and recent development. We're assuming that any early road would have been on a similar line to the eventual course of Roman Road 28A, usually known as the Roman Ridge in this part of the world, which did run right underneath where the A1 now is. Looking at that, you can see quite a mess of ditches. Interpreting phasing from a gradiometer plot is never easy and often unwise. However, in this case, it's very clear how some ditches cut earlier ones. And if I look at the interpretation, what I want to draw your attention to first is the features marked in yellow, where you can see very clearly we do have a parrot beak fort. Gordon Maxwell argued some time ago that parrot beak entrances were a feature of forts built by the 2nd Legion Adiutrix. Although one example in Wales, and a potential second, has led to some questioning of this, there's not actually any reason why a detachment of the Legion couldn't have been stationed in that part of Wales temporarily. The Legion was based at Lincoln from its arrival in this country until the mid-70s, when it appears to have been transferred to Chester, being withdrawn from Britain in around about AD 86. Now, if Maxwell was right, and assuming then that the fort was built whilst the 2nd were at Lincoln, this gives a possible date range for the Flavian fort of just a few years, realistically at the very, very earliest, late AD 70 to AD 76-ish, possibly a little later. And here's the important thing. The geophysics clearly shows 2 forts that predate this, all on slightly different orientations. They're the ones marked in green and the ones marked in blue. I don't have any time to look at this in detail. Suffice to say, it is very hard to see how or why 3 distinct forts could have been built all in the space of 7 years on the same site. Seems incredibly unlikely. And if that wasn't enough, very recently, a silver unit of the Iceni, dating to between AD 10 and 43, was found a relatively short distance southeast of Burg Wallace Fort. The coin could feasibly still have been traded and mislaid sometime after the Boudiccan Rebellion, but given the very, very few finds of Icenian coinage, there really are just 3 or 4 found in Yorkshire, the discovery of this on a potentially very early Roman site has to be important. Okay, so if a road went either through Burgwallis, if a road did go through Burgwallis or a route went through Burgwallis, where next? Most likely it would follow the same course as the later road, Roman Road 28, the Roman Ridge did, and head through Castleford. Now, the Roman fort at Castleford is now covered by the modern town, leaving us no future opportunities for study. However, recent analysis of Roman coinage from Castleford by Richard Brickstock does suggest the possibility of deposition of at least some coins in the late AD 60s. Whichever route was taken, or both, as I'll argue later, the next stage in the journey is Newton-Kyme. Newton-Kyme sits on the River Wharfe. That's an aerial I took in 2018. Unfortunately, we've been unable to gain permission to survey the site. We're entirely dependent on aerial photography, which is why I took these drone shots in the summer of 2018 when conditions were particularly good. You can see the road approaching through the Vicus, which is just off the shot to the south and heading north through the large late fort and in turn through an earlier one there. If we now look to a vertical view, things become a little bit clearer. There is clearly a Flavian fort. Note the Parrot Beak entrance again, absolutely clear, showing on the crop marks. That's been long suspected, so it's not a big surprise. We're going to take a particular look, however, not at the Parrot Beak, but at the road through the site. There are at least 3 discernible phases and potentially 4. The first one that we can see for certain, I click my little button, is marked in red there. That approaches the complex as the same alignment as its successors through the Vicus, but you can see clearly how it's cut by the later fort and just slightly by the Flavian one there. Next, oh, sorry, missed a bit. Yeah, it does change alignment at that point. If I just click back again, can you see, hopefully, those features there? The change of alignment is perfectly aligned up with those. Are those the defences of an earlier site, an earlier fort, perhaps? It's an earlier something, that's for certain. Next, we have the road that runs through the Flavian fort. It takes exactly the same line, but then is forced to do a kink because the siting of the Flavian fort's gate is out of line with the existing road. It then runs along the Via Principalis of the Flavian fort. And finally, we have the road that runs through the latest fort. Again, it has to do a kink because of the siting of its southern gate, and then adopts exactly the same route as it runs through the site. Finally, there is another one which you can just see just there. We can't ascribe any date to that. It appears to be heading to the same point through the Vicus as the other 3. But beyond that, we can't say anything about it. What we can say for certain is that there is at least 1 phase before the Flavian one, and potentially 2. But that's not the end of the story. There is an even earlier Roman site here, a temporary camp. There's actually 2. The eastern ditch of the camp that we're interested in, that's the one marked here, runs underneath, as you can see, the entire site. It was one of 2 recognised by von Boutwood during analysis of the site for the Royal Commission. We actually managed to survey 22 hectares to the west of the modern track known as the Rudgate, which is a different ownership to the main site. And we've successfully identified the western portions of both the known camps. Now, the crucial thing here is the size of this one. It measures inside its ditch 23.4 hectares and probably a precise measurement of 15 by 12 actus, and actus is 120 Roman feet, across the ramparts. This would make it the biggest in England. There's one in Herefordshire that's almost exactly the same size. It is clearly for a very large army being assembled here, presumably ready to move north. Given the clear fort sequencing, it's very hard to reconcile a fort of this size with the Flavian period. However, Tacitus tells us that Paulinus, the then governor, gathered his entire army under Cambus after the Boudiccan rebellion in AD 60, where he intended to finish off what was left of the war. Was Newton-Kime the focus for an invasion of Brigantia that never actually happened due to Paulinus' sudden and unexpected recall? We don't know, it is speculation. But if Maxwell's theory is correct, the camp must surely predate the arrival of Petilius Cerialis in the early AD 70s, which does make the idea of this being under Paulinus very, very attractive. Next, the next stage upwards is at Rowcliffe. Rowcliffe is just to the west of Aldborough, the later Roman town of Isurium Brigantum, the civitas capital of the Brigantes. There is evidence for Flavian activity at Aldborough, but Rowcliffe is usually assumed to be earlier or at least contemporary. The dating of the fort at Rowcliffe is based upon finds from excavation in the settlement area of the fort when the A1, which is here, was widened in 1993 to 5. These all suggest a date of circa AD 71 for the settlement, although recent reassessment of the coins by Richard Brickstock does not rule out an earlier date in the late 60s. Indeed, the Samian assemblage doesn't rule out such a date either. Unlike Burg Wallis or Newton-Kime, though, there is no clear phasing. You'll notice there appear to be 4 ditches. Mike Bishop, in his interpretation of the pair of linears which showed on the original geophysics in the 90s, interpreted those 2 inner ones as the post trenches for a box rampart. Indeed, even after seeing our images, he still interprets them as such. It might be argued, however, that this interpretation is problematic, given that those 2 ditches or trenches are approximately 2.5 meters wide, and the fact that on the western side, the 2 appear to merge into 1, which couldn't happen if you had a box rampart. It gets actually a little bit worse because on the eastern side, there doesn't appear to be any ditch at all. The other thing that counts against them being from a box rampart is the sheer strength of the responses, which you normally only get when you have a lot of rubbish thrown into a pit or a ditch. So, given the clear internal layout, is it feasible there could actually be one fort precisely within another? There is no clear internal layout, unfortunately, to be able to disentangle this. It's always possible that an earlier fort that we're looking for was located nearby and not actually here. However, we certainly have evidence for an earlier camp that predates this. If I just turn backwards, you can just see the north-south ditches and the eastern one, and they're all at right angles to each other. We can't see any corners, but by extrapolation, we can be fairly sure that that is an early camp. Which takes us where? We now still have a gap between Rowcliffe and Scotch Corner and Stanick. And it was actually Peter Adaman who pointed out that if I'm right about this, there must be a missing site between Rowcliffe and Scotch Corner. The missing site can't be Catterick, which is about here. It's far too close to Scotch Corner. Neither can it be Heelan Bridge, which is about there, which has been very, very well excavated, and there is no Flavian or earlier site there. So we end up looking for a site that's next to a watercourse, as most Roman forts are, and the only one that fits the bill is Leeming, and which is perfectly placed between Rowcliffe and Stanick. Unfortunately, it is the likely site is there. Sadly, when all that housing was built, no archaeological work was done. It was done too long ago. We're currently attempting to identify local landowners with a view to doing geophysics in the area around the houses. We might be lucky. That appears to be the best site, but there's just a chance we might get some indications of Roman activity around there. Watch this space. So we've looked at a whole series of sites along 2 potential routes. Now I just want to quickly examine the distances between them, because this is actually very important. The first column is the route starting off at Ad Pontum on the Fosse Way, running to Stanwick, not Scotch Corner, via Rowell, and you'll notice how evenly spaced all these sites are. I've included one at Pearlthorpe here, which I didn't talk about simply because I haven't had time. That is where we suspect there could have been another intermediate site, yet to know for certain. So the distances range from 14.4 miles up to 17.2 miles. The spacing is slightly wider than most of the intervals on the other route, but those vary massively, even if you combine the Ad Pontum and Osmonthorpe figures. We're suggesting, therefore, that a route was originally planned directly across the Humber Head levels, and a fort was built at Rowell Manor. But when it was realised that such a route was impractical in winter, a dry land route was used via Bergwallis and Castleford. Both routes will have been used well before AD 71 and the arrival of Petelius Cerealis. But is either hypothetical route real? You'll notice I keep calling them routes and not roads. We only actually have evidence of a road, a formal road, as far as about half a mile north of Rossington, and then we lose it under Doncaster. We have no evidence to suggest that an early road was actually constructed along either route. It may not have been. They may have utilised pre-existing Iron Age trackways. So I ask the question, is either hypothetical route real? We can't state that with certainty. All I can do is present this as a theory based largely on circumstantial evidence and the idea, the crucial idea, that Parrotbeak forts were built by the 2nd Legion Adiutrix. It's an unproven and often questioned theory. That said, although the evidence is circumstantial, there is an awful lot of it, including some I simply didn't have time to include today. A fortified route into Brigantia, however, at least predating Petilius Cerealis, i.e. before AD 71, must now be considered a distinct possibility. Where's me? And that's it, if everybody wants to come in.
Well, perhaps I could ask one, if I may, from the chair. Well, the two or three points, quick points I'd like to make, if I may. One of the interesting aspects of the coming back to the first talk, of the rerouting of the road up to Kirby Thorpe, is it brings it closer to the site of the discovery of the Crosby Garrett helmet, and it gives a greater degree of focus on why the helmet was buried where it was, which I've been to the site, is in the middle of nowhere. But this wonderful find is up right up in the moor. So Roman roads are very important in helping us understand context in that case. What I wanted to do, if I may, is to offer a challenge to David. Instead of looking at the Western Stane Gate, can you look at the Eastern Stane Gate, which I know is outside your area? But the interesting thing about Hadrian's Wall is, in its very first phase, for it to work effectively, there ought to be forts east of Corbridge, which we've never found. And while, sorry?
I'm sworn to secrecy around Corbridge. I have been out of area and I'm sworn to secrecy. There's an embargo on it. Sorry.
Well, yes, what can
But
one
to fill you
say?
in, I didn't find anything. I was looking north of the river from Corbridge over, and I didn't find anything north of the river, but I didn't look
No.
south.
No, it should be between the. You would expect something between the river and the wall. But anyway, it's embargoed. It's embargoed. Can I come back to one of Mike's points, which I thought was very interesting, which was it's unlikely that we get 3 forts at a particular site in a very short period. Actually, I checked this the other day by chance, but about 25 years ago, I went to a very interesting talk by Professor Ben Isaac, who lives and works in Israel. And he discussed how the Israeli army had operated in relationship to its incursions into southern Lebanon. And he started out, he said, well, you know, you push forward. So you create an advanced post, and then you reinforce that so it becomes a more significant base, and then you push forward from that so it becomes a rear base. But you need a supply point for your prongs running out from this site, so it then becomes a supply base. So you've got four different functions there, and then the army gradually withdraws, and you have a similar series of functions as it withdraws. Well, I'm not pretending that this is we can see this everywhere, but what Ben was trying to say very clearly, I think, was it's actually very difficult to work out what the function of some forts was, because they changed in relationship to circumstances. And I think the Roman army was no different. In a very fluid period at the beginning of a period of conquest or invasion, intervention into frontier regions, one might indeed, I would like to suggest, find that there are several forts being changed relatively quickly, which we might find surprising, but we can find modern parallels to.
It's certainly possible. Can't rule it out. The problem we've got at Burg Wallace, obviously, is that we only have about a quarter of the fort surviving, so we can't get a really good picture of it.
Yeah.
But we do appear to have granaries from the 2 early periods which don't align at all, and that would suggest that if it had been altered in any way, it was almost completely razed to the ground and started again. Which, if a fort was simply changing its function and being developed, would you expect a complete demolition and rebuild? I'm not so sure.
Well, I mean, this is rather strangely to us what the Roman army seem to have done. If I dare trespass back into Corbridge, where we do have a lot of evidence from the fort site, it does seem to, each time the unit moves out, it demolishes the fort and leaves a tabula rasa, which the new unit comes in and builds on top of. It's the same at Vindolanda, very good example at Vindolanda as well. Very surprising to us, but that's how they seem to operate.
I would certainly be interested if anybody who's watching this is aware of any forts that were clearly rebuilt over such a short potential time period, then clearly we need to know about it.
Yeah,
that's been proven. I'm not aware of any that have, but that's not to say it's impossible.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, Dave Felt asks that maybe the evidence from Scotch Corner might help reinforce your theory about pre-Cerealian, the pre-Cerealian road.
Yes, with only 20 minutes. Yeah, sorry, David, I couldn't go into any. That's David Fell. There's too many Davids around today. I couldn't go into any detail. I simply didn't have the time. Otherwise, I would have done. But you're quite right. The evidence that you found at Scotch Corner does suggest the possibility, at least, of a road that predates what we know as Deer Street. So it is a distinct possibility, an early road leading there. There was a whole stack of other things I didn't mention, like which I will now because I can, in inverted commas, temporary camp, more accurately, I think, a permanent camp for temporary occupation, sited at Rokeby Park, which David Fell's aware of. Curiously, that faces east, which it would only do if a perceived threat was from the east. Rokeby is substantially to the west of Scotch Corner. It is weird.
The one Roman writer does say that if you are going to lay out your camp, it should face towards the enemy to the point it's guarding, like a river crossing, or to the east, to the rising sun, as I'm sure you know. So I shouldn't think I wouldn't have thought we should be so worried about that.
Yeah, yes and no, David. The problem is that it's in the angle between the Greta and the Tees, and the Greta is to the east of the camp. So yes, it is facing east, but it is the wrong side of the river from a defensive point of view.
Yeah. Can I come back to the very first paper and ask a really cheeky question? I was born and brought up in Blackpool, and I still have my Ordnance Survey maps from the 1950s marked up with a line of Roman roads, including one road which you mentioned, which passed Cabus Cross and to Cockerham, where the churchyard still contains the tomb chest of my fourth great-grandparents, still in existence there. So I was fascinated with Cockerham. And there's a thought to be a stump of a Roman milestone outside Forton Hall. Do you believe it?
Yeah, there is a milestone there. It was moved from somewhere in the grounds of Forton Farm or Forton Hall to the crossroads. That road also turned up, sorry, I'm losing my voice, it turned up another milestone at just south of, well, actually in Cabus Parish, just south of where I showed. It was stood by the side of the road for 200 years and nobody realised it was a Roman milestone. It was only when the route was shown going past it that, that's a Roman milestone. And it's the same diameter as the one at Forton Hall. Yeah, so talking about Blackpool, the road west of Kirkham, the famous or infamous Danes Pad.
Yes.
No, it doesn't exist.
Well, I can have a discussion with you about that. I mean, what's interesting to me is the Roman coins along the line of the road, which suggests there's something there. But we haven't got time for that. What I must do is thank you all very heartily on behalf of the RAI for each of your really informative, as my professor would have said, educational talks, and most importantly, demonstrating the value of looking again at old problems, the value of bringing in new technologies, as you have all done, and obviously relating that to wider issues, again, which you have done, and helping us understand the history of Roman Britain in that way. And I think importantly too, how the Roman army, or the Roman state, should I say, managed to control such a vast territory, and part of the answer you've given us today, which is Roman roads. So thank you very much on behalf of the Royal Archaeological Institute for your talks, I beg your pardon, to us all today. Thank you, and thank you for listening, everybody else, and enjoy the next lecture if you're staying on. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.